Let me show you how and why I made this fabric collage watermelon. It's part of my collection of Quilt As You Go hexagon pieces. Don't you think this striped green fabric is a perfect watermelon rind? I also grabbed a bunch of red and pink and orange bits of cloth as well, and I started out by just cutting a pointy triangle, and then I grabbed a little bit of red embroidery thread and started stitching it down somewhere near the top so that my watermelon slice is going to be sitting on the table there, pointing up towards the sky, sort of similar to this painting that I did in my 52 Things project. So after I finished sewing on that first bit of cloth, I picked out another piece, slightly different color, and keeping that point at the top, I stitched that second piece down as well. And you'll notice that I didn't plan the whole thing out when I started. I'm just making one decision at the time. I chose that first piece of cloth, sewed it down, then I chose the second piece of cloth, and I'm sewing it down without thinking about what comes next. And I know for some people that's really uncomfortable to not know what the finished piece is going to look like. I think it's a really good thing to practice, not knowing what the end is going to look like and letting things emerge. It can be a really good way to practice some of those things that turn up in life. There are all kinds of unexpected things that happen in life. The idea for that painting came when we all piled into the car and headed out of the city to an annual family event. No, we did not go camping. No, definitely not. Now I've grabbed a piece of polka dotted fuchsia cloth and I'm stitching that down. I'm not worrying about what the patterns are. I can always modify those by choosing different colors of thread and stitching over parts of the cloth so that the patterns are less obvious. I don't even know what this event is called, but it's a big sale that they have in a farming community near where we live, and we go every year. We call it MCC, which stands for Mennonite Central Committee. It's my husband's family are Mennonites, and they are a conservative Christian denomination. The most conservative Mennonites wear very simple, unadorned clothing like the women in this picture who were actually playing volleyball, which amused me a lot because my husband's family are big volleyball fans. Now I've got a red star on an orange background and I'm just adding more and more and more. And really my biggest choices are which piece of cloth is going to fit in the space that I have available. And if I've got a tiny little space, then I'll look for a tiny little piece of cloth. Now, Mennonites are well known for their quilts, and there were lots of quilts on display and for sale at the event that we went to. I almost bought one of these hexagon quilts, but then I walked away and somebody else bought it before I had time to go back and change my mind. Now, in addition to quilts, Mennonites are also really fond of food. Things like this watermelon and rollkuchen, which is something that Mennonites like to eat for supper on hot summer days. Another thing that they had that really amused me is Mennonite poutine. Although I love poutine, I love farmer sausage, I do not recommend the Mennonite poutine. So that's the whole why I made this piece. Now let's go back to the actual making of it. About this point, I'm getting a little bit concerned that my wedge is getting quite wide, so I thought this was a good time to add my rind, my green rind along the bottom edge, and I can continue to add pieces after I've got the bottom part of my watermelon established. So I've cut out a curved shape, and now I'm just going to consider how I can place this. And now I've realized that the shape that I've cut out is not going to be big enough for the red wedge part that I've already put down, which is not a problem at all. I place that first bit where it fits and I'm going to stitch it down, and then I'll cut out another bit to finish off the end, and that's how simple it is. I don't need any templates and you don't either. So I personally like to jump around from thing to thing when I'm working on these. So now I decided instead of finishing off the rind at the bottom, I'm going to create a 3D appearance to my wedge. Now I happen to have this strip of darker red cloth that I can sew down on one side here that will create the look of a 3D wedge, and I really like the way that that worked out. While I was working on this watermelon, I started to think about what I might want to do for a stitch along project for 2024, and I came up with the idea of making all kinds of things on tables. And for our first month, for January, we started off with citrus fruit on tables. Well, and this is the piece that we worked on together over January. And if you're interested in joining us and creating all kinds of other things on tables, you can head over to my Ko-fi channel and get those full tutorials. Even if you don't want to actually make your own, but you just like more content, more of my videos, you can head over to the Ko-fi channel and sign up for a subscription that starts at $3 Canadian per month, which is even less in other currencies, I'm led to believe, and join us over there. I think that we've been taught our whole lives that we should use patterns and do things in an organized, regular manner, and certainly there are times when that is an important thing to do, but not always. Playing with little bits of cloth doesn't necessarily need to be done in that organized way. We all have the ability to make our own choices and our own decisions, and that's what I'm doing here. And now I'm just filling in the space with more bits of cloth. Some of them are lighter and have more white, which makes my watermelon look nice and juicy. Those little speckles of white represent highlights or areas where the light is bouncing off the watermelon that make it look really shiny and juicy. And allowing those things to show up without planning them creates a really natural looking, interesting looking watermelon that's not at all stiff and planned. And at this point I realized that I'd forgotten to include the pith, the white area that's between the red watermelon area and the skin. So I've chosen this narrow strip of cloth that's kind of a creamy beige color, and I'm sewing that on, starting in the middle and working my way out to the outside edge. And the reason I'm doing that, because this is a straight piece of cloth, if I started at one edge and then curved it around to the other edge, the one edge where I started would be flat and on grain, and then I would be stretching that little piece of cloth more and more and more as I worked my way around the circle. By starting in the middle, I start out with my cloth unstretched and I stretch it out to one side, but then as I go to the other side, it gets stretched out the other way, so it's only getting stretched half as much. I hope that made sense. And I only know that by years of experience in doing these sorts of things. Once I've got one half sewn down, I'll go back and sew down the other side as well. And I didn't finish sewing the rind on there. I'll have to finish sewing the green skin back on as well, that extra bit there. I'm not sure why I didn't sew it on in the first place, but I didn't. And you'll notice the rind there, it's wider on one side where I've got the 3D effect going on, and narrower on the other side. It's all contributing to the 3D appearance of my watermelon. And if my white cloth isn't long enough, I can always cut off another bit and add it on, just like I did with the green part. And it all works out in the end. If I add enough stitches, you can't see where all the edges are, where the pieces were joined together. I'm just doing simple stitches, just running stitch and overcast or whip stitch, just whatever I feel like, whatever feels like it would fit. I've left the rest of the green part loose there so that I can sew it down once I've got all of the flesh sewn down, so I know exactly where it should go. And just a little detail here, I'm adding a little bit of the white there on the edge to continue that illusion that it's a 3D shape and just not a flat piece of watermelon. And that's just a little extra detail there. There's lots and lots and lots of details going on. And now I'm just going all over with lots of different colors of bits of floss, varying the number of threads. Sometimes I use one, sometimes I use 2, and I'm just doing small little seed stitches all over, making sure the ends of all of the bits of cloth are secured down well. And that's what my watermelon looks like. I quite like the way it looks. Now, one more detail that I'm going to add along the bottom here is I'm going to add a cast shadow. The dark area on the table where the watermelon is blocking the light from reaching that area. I'm using either a dark green or a navy blue thread there, and I'm just doing some straight stitches just in a sort of a fairly loose line there along the bottom there, just a slight suggestion that there's a shadow there. It makes it look like the watermelon is sitting on the table rather than floating in the air. And at this point, because I'm being a little bit extra, I'm just adding extra details. I'm adding a row of blanket stitch between that white strip and the pink flesh, just to add a little bit of a transition, a little bit more subtle transition. And I can keep going and going and going. There's lots of stitching that ends up here. And I need to do lots of stitching just in all directions to really disguise the patterns in the fabric that I've used, because I don't necessarily want those to be really obvious. And now I know that most watermelons these days are usually seedless, but I really love the look of those really dark black watermelon seeds, so I decided to include them. And I'm using an assortment of dark green and dark blue threads. And I'm using 3 or 4 of them together, and I'm going to use something called oyster stitch. And I already made a video showing myself learning oyster stitch. So this is like kind of a variation of a double chain stitch. So basically what you do is you make a chain stitch which has one leg that's longer than the other. Instead of securing off that chain stitch, you go back down through that longer leg, and now you make another chain stitch basically on top of the previous one, and that is called an oyster stitch. Now you don't have to do an oyster stitch necessarily. You could just do two chain stitches on top of each other, but I'm just showing off here because I've learned a new stitch. I'm going to make lots of these little oyster stitches, all pointing straight up, and I think that they create very, very nice looking watermelon seeds. And there you go. There is my finished watermelon. I'm pretty thrilled with how it turned out, and I hope you like it too. Anyway, happy stitching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.